digital series. Our topic for discussion is glocalisation, localising production and capacity building for survival and success. I'm Declan Curry. I've been a journalist and broadcaster of some 30 years experience, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this discussion today. Our speakers are Bright Simmons. He's president of mPedigree. That's an enterprise specialising in technological innovations and supply chains with offices in Africa, India and Europe. Xiaozhun, who's the Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Dr. Cecilia Ugaz Estrada, who's Special Advisor and a former Policy Research Director at UNIDO. Discussion, and we're grateful to you for giving us your time today. Let's start with the topic that's dominating world discourse at the moment, coronavirus and its impact. Cecilia Ugaz Estrada, just an opening thought from you on what you think the disruption from coronavirus might be for global supply chains. I'm particularly interested as to whether you think it will encourage businesses to develop more local sourcing.
Yes, of course, also the fellow panelists. I think, of course, a massive shock like the corona pandemic is causing is, of course, making the big enterprises and countries also to reassess what is the strategy for production, right? And I think, on one hand, this can also lead to the possibility of thinking that we can be better off if we source locally. And in addition to that, the fourth industrial revolution, the new technologies may be allowing to do that actually at a cheaper cost. Because in particular, when you think about automation and the big, sort of change that it can entail in terms of, lowering the labor costs, let's say, we could manage really to replace some, displace some workers and use machines instead. That could make actually that the comparative advantage of, from developing countries of having, let's say, relatively cheap labor and, less skilled and cheaper labor can be eroded. So this, all this, let's say, comparative advantage can be, destroyed, and then, the production can be brought actually closer from the headquarters of many transnational corporations that are the.
Thank you, and we'll develop those points throughout our discussion in this session. Xiaozhun, from the World Trade Organization, I wonder, is there a danger that the impact of coronavirus on global supply chains is that it makes us a little less global?
Well, thank you very much, Declan. I think we all know that we are facing very severe economic repercussions. And the WTO economists estimate merchandise trade may fall by 13% to 32%. So it's a very sad picture. But this downturn was not caused by economic factors. Basically, it is a health emergency. Therefore, the severity of the economic crisis will depend on how fast this pandemic that makes this crisis a little bit different or distinct from the previous one in 2008. More than a third of the predicted decline of world trade is caused by rising trade costs. Travel restrictions, border checks, and changes in port protocols are just some of the measures which caused enormous disruptions in transport. So basically, I don't believe these changes are likely to stay with us forever. Going forward, the structure of supply chains will depend on whether one trend is China moving up the value chain due to its industrial strategies or rising labor costs. And another important trend is increasing adoption. of labor-saving technologies in modern manufacturing, such as industrial robots. So that's what said by Cecilia. Meanwhile, we believe that this pandemic may accelerate the trend of production automation. And we know that this trend may reduce some of the opportunities in low-skill manufacturing. So developing countries, even they will lose some advantages, but they may find new opportunities in supplying the growing demand for digital services. So that's my view.
Thank you. Cecilia, Ugaz, Estrada, you had a quick observation.
Yeah, I just wanted to complement actually what Mr. G said before me, and also rounded a little bit the initial ideas, and just by saying what is left for developing countries in this context, right? And I think there is a very important possibility of actually strengthening the possibility of becoming more regionally oriented. I think developing countries have now a real opportunity to be able to to actually expand their markets by really, exporting and importing from their neighbors. And if you take Latin America, it's 650 million people. And I think, maybe, the possibility of not being as globalized as before, for all the reasons that we all know that have been brought, to light by this pandemic, but still, it remains the possibility of expanding markets by actually using it, increasing trends of regionalization. And the same applies for the African continent. I think probably only Asians have been so far able to sort of, explore a little more, the possibilities of using their own region as an expanded market. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bright Simmons, you're a significant leader of business in this area, and you've got a substantial corporate presence in across the continent of Africa as well.
Very old debate. However, there are some fascinating contradictions that arise. One, it's not particularly different whether you are trading globally or regionally when it comes to these barriers. So the barriers that COVID-19 has imposed affect regional trade. Regional trade is more impacted. Some of you may be following the discussion around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Integration agenda, it'll be quite surprising if they're able to achieve that by closing borders. I don't see how trading with Nigeria becomes easier if these forces continue to prevail than trading with Germany. In fact, in some cases, in respect of costs, it's actually more expensive to trade within Africa than to trade internationally. If you take movement as an example, the cost of tickets are actually higher for some flights than it is for Africa-Europe flights, for instance. I was looking at the cargo routes recently, and I was observing that connections between African countries and European connections between African countries and some other African countries. So whatever dynamics are propelled by this particular pandemic, African governments have a lot of incentive to try and suppress those dynamics. That's number one. Number two, and here is where I disagree a little bit with my very good friend from the World Trade Organization, the China dynamic, it's somewhat more complicated. So we've seen, for instance, an attempt from the Chinese to export modular industrial capability. What do I mean by that? So in the past, the Chinese government, the Chinese business community had focused on exporting finished goods to Africa. Now we are seeing the export of modular industrial applications. So they are exporting the processing plants in modular form so they can fit more into an African context. We are also seeing a situation where small batch manufacturing is extremely useful nowadays because of concerns about health, etc. So people are not always that keen on some of the highly processed food items as an example, and they are moving towards small batch manufacturing, where automation is not very useful. So if people want to buy less processed cereals for breakfast, they're not looking for the most automated cornflakes factory. So they are building more small batch manufacturing. So these modular industrial applications are very interesting. And that acts as a trend, somewhat against some of the automation fears that some commentators have. The last point I'll make, and this is quite critical, is the fact that when you look at both the domestic consumption as well as the exports of African countries, you find very high levels of intermediate products. So essentially, to produce powdered milk, Ghana imports most of the milk. Sorry, to produce yogurt, Ghana used to import a lot of the milk that goes into the yogurt from Denmark. Now, to produce other products of similar nature, we were estimating in the region of 75 to 80% of the content coming from overseas. South Africa has 20% of its exports coming from overseas. That's the foreign content of the exports. Local consumption even higher. So in some ways, actually, it's not that easy, even if you wanted to do that, to maintain a sourcing regime that involves cutting yourself off global value chains. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that. We've looked at AGOA as an example, and that is also a situation where, in a lot of instances, you need the intermediates to come from overseas in order to take advantage of that. AGOA, for instance, allows or affords African producers and give them access to American markets. So those are important caveats.
Thank you. Cecilia, Ugaz, Estrada, some reaction, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this, I just wanted to complement a little bit what Simons was saying. I think, of course, we are not really talking about going back to closing borders. I think that experience and history really shows it doesn't work. Right? I think we have learned something, in recent history and economic history, that these are the things that we shouldn't do. And actually, some of the excessive cost and regulations that Simons was mentioning, for instance, that really preclude intra-trade within Africa, precisely these are the things that we ought to be able to reassess and actually change, because this is precisely what is really, sort of not really making this, possibility of integration possible. Also coming back to the whole concept of, import substitution, I think, again, I don't think anybody is really, sort of proclaiming again that we should go back to the old times of import substitution. I think, this history really shows that there were lots of things that needed to be done in a different way in order for this, import substitution to work a bit better. In particular, the whole issue of protectionism, and in particular protectionism without deadline, because that was the main problem, right? Really the efforts of industrialization were not really confronted with competition. And that issue was not really in the mind when, the policies were put in place. And by overprotecting the industry, to do is to have really probably a very, very inefficient way of producing. But this is to say, of course, history is there to tell us lots of lessons on how to really go about, this possibility of having a new regionalization, and, this as an alternative, and of course not excluding the possibility of going back to global value chains if this is possible. But what happens if it's not? I think this is something that also developing countries should consider very seriously, knowing that definitely they need a better integration to global markets and to world markets in order to be able to continue the path to growth.
Thank you. Xiaozhun.
Yeah, I think now we are discussing how developing countries can join global value chains or supply chains. And we know that those multinational companies, when they react to this crisis, be guided by standard economic advantages, which are existing manufacturing capacity, competitive labor costs, skilled workforce, and trade value chains the governments of developing countries need to limit their avoidable trade costs. So this involves removing tariffs, streamlining non-tariff measures, and implementing travel restrictions and border controls in a more or minimize they will have better opportunities to attract those production capacity shifted from other countries.
Thank you. And this area of policy is an interesting one, but it runs alongside the capacity for innovation in technology. And Bright Simmons, that's your particular area of specialism. How do you see the technologies that arise from the fourth industrial revolution being used to include and to integrate marginalized communities and SMEs in global value chains?
Very important question. One of the challenges that we've seen for many years seriously constrain the capacity of SMEs to export has been the standards issue. So the challenge with certification programs, supplier certification programs in particular. If you think of an attempt to, if you wanted to export agro-processed or agro-input-based items, so processed foods and the likes, you confront with a vast array of phytosanitary standards regimes in Europe, which are enforced not only by the national authorities, but also by the retail chains. So if you think of your Tesco's or your Sainsbury's, they're not buying bananas from Ghana unless the producer of that banana has immense capacity to comply with sometimes pretty elaborate certification schemes. The challenge that used to arise until very recently was that all of this stuff required international travel, so consultants had to move. If you wanted to be ISO certified or PDCSS certified, even if you're a service providers in IT like I am, what virtual capabilities now enable is for us to reduce the cost of skills importation, as an example. So we have had situations where certification bodies completely does the certification program online. That will cut cost by as much as 95% in some instances. For the first time, making it possible for some SMEs, some small and medium scale enterprises, to meet these demands and be able to export overseas. In the area of the trading services in particular, the opportunities are immense if we could bring down the biases that operate against SMEs in Africa. If we could, for instance, be able to sell our fintech solutions to banks in Europe, because we're able to meet the very rigorous certification standards that the financial authorities in Europe demand. If we're able to do that from Africa, you're talking of billions of dollars of potential revenues going into African value chains in technology. And that is just one area. That is just certification using virtual tools. We know, for instance, that when it comes to medical talent surpluses, the only way it used to operate in the past was that talented Africans had to literally move out of Africa. So if you were a good surgeon, today there are technologies that will enable telemedical applications, such that a very top consultant in Ghana could split their time between Kwalebu Hospital and Guy Hospital in London. That is the world that the 4 IRs, if we take them seriously, could usher in. So talent recirculation could be much more efficient. The area of conserving resources generally. So if you're thinking of the carbon issue that is going to become very important nowadays as we go forward, there is capabilities within new materials, etc., to make countries that were typically out of discussions around climate innovation and the rest, all of a sudden
image that Bright Simmons paints for us of technology reducing costs, reducing barriers, enabling a greater participation by SMEs around the world. What needs to be done on the policy side, on the government side, to allow this to happen, to encourage SMEs to adopt these technological innovations?
Yeah, I think it is very interesting, and I think these are only really fantastic, you know. But of course, I mean, I would say there are up to 3 different groups of policies that I would say that need to be really as preconditions in order for this absorption of new technologies to happen, especially in developing countries, and in particular, making it possible for SMEs, you know, small and medium-sized enterprises, to also, you know, sort of jump into the wagon of these new ways of production. I would say the first one is it has to do with investment in digital infrastructure. We all know, you know, that, you know, the big gaps that there are, you know, all over the developing world in terms of being able to have broadband, you know, adequate really internet connections. These kind of things are really basic. Without that, you can really not go. It's a non-starter. I would say the second set of policies also has to do with, you know, some particular targeting and, you know, what we call readiness assessment. You know, what is really happening at the level of SMEs. You know, we know for sure that having these technologies. The other issues, of course, have to do with building capabilities at the level of workers. You know, our former traditional, the model we know, basically was insertion into the global markets using really low-skilled, you know, cheap labor, if you want, and also in particular women. You know, there were lots of women that, you know, were really, you know, able to access labor markets in the industrial sector at the level of the, you know, apparel, textile, leather production. But unfortunately, you know, these kind of jobs, you know, if automation goes on, are disappear. So actually, unfortunately, women are really working on activities and tasks that are very prone to be automated. So we have to take care of that, really, you know, to be able to see how can we really build the capacities, you know, at the level of the workers. You know, we can sort of try to think about, you know, twinning programs, you know, between countries, you know, big enterprises trying to help small enterprises and so on, in order to be able to build up these capabilities that could allow workers not to be displaced and continue working and doing yet, you know, a further contribution to the production of the enterprise. Another in the government and the private sector. You know, I think we are really sort of still in this era of, you know, like, you know, warring camps. I think really it's hard time to try to devise ways of, you know, of building, for instance, industrial policies with multi-stakeholder approach. I mean, it doesn't harm. These things cannot be decided really in government quarters. You need to involve, you know, the trade, the chambers. You need to involve the industrial chambers. You need to involve also small NGOs working, you know, on the industrial sector in particular, in order to be able to listen from all the stakeholders and try to have more realistic policies.
So, Cecilia, Ugaz, Estrada, what you're talking about there is greater collaboration among stakeholders. This is more than just a financial and a standards issue. You're talking here about, in some cases, a cultural evolution as well.
Absolutely. I think, you know, it's far gone the era of, you know, top-down policy making. I don't think that will work anymore. And, you know, when I also talk about collaboration, I think it's very important to realize that it also has to be intra-government collaboration. It's not just Minister of Industry working and, you know, Finance Minister working. We really have to achieve some kind of collaboration and policies that reinforce each other. Because, of course, educational policies will at the end have to do something with the insertion of labor, you know, into this newly technified atmosphere of work. So I think, you know, there's lots of things that need to be improved in terms of the way that we really make policy, and industrial policy in particular.
Xiaozhun, this is a challenging policy agenda for many of the governments that you and the WTO will work with.
Yes, I think basically I agree with the comments made by Bright and Cecilia. I think the fourth industrial revolution technologies can help integrate SMEs in trade and in global value chains in at least 4 ways: by boosting their competitiveness, by significantly reducing trade costs, by improving access to trade finance, and by supplying means to create technology solutions themselves. So let me take just a small example. Access to trade finance is a serious problem for SMEs who want to participate in global value chains. And according to an Asian Development Bank study, over half of trade finance requests by SMEs are rejected, against just 7% for multinational companies. This undermined those SMEs' integration in trade and GVCs. But fortunately, now we know that the new technologies such as blockchain platforms can enormously facilitate SMEs' access to trade finance. Although for the moment, those new technologies are not widespread, but they hold a huge promise for SMEs' potential to grow in the future through international trade.
Brad Simmons, what is it going to take to have a greater adoption of these technologies across industries so that SMEs become more supply chains?
This is a fascinating line of inquiry, and I think Estrada's points are very forward-looking and very interesting. For the last year and a half, actually for the last 2 years to be precise, we've had the opportunity in the digital domain to study some very fascinating phenomena. We now have the operation of global digital value chains at local level, which have operated for a significant length of time, and we are now able to judge what really is happening with these kinds of ecosystem-dependent developments. So quite clear that, you know, collaboration just doesn't happen. And collaboration that is just multilateral or even bilateral, just bilateral or even multilateral, is not as easily founded as we might think. So the question was why? It appeared as if you needed something in the ecosystem to gel. And it was difficult getting empirical evidence until, you know, at least within the digital ecosystem, until we had organizations like Uber, Facebook, and the rest, but particularly those that have a physical and a digital value chain fused together. So Uber is a very good example. These are organizations that operate in mid-space as well as in cyberspace, in physical space as well as in cyberspace. And when we've seen them operate in Africa, it's been fascinating observing how they've had to reorganize their local value chains to try and deliver the service in the same way as they deliver it anywhere in the world. Very fascinating problem. The quick verdict is that they are not often able to. But the reason they are not often able to, that is to provide uniformly, consistent operations across borders in Africa as well as systems. And obviously I don't have a lot of time to delve into it, but the primary principle is this. When it comes to how you build these things, the most important element is what we are calling transmediaries. So not intermediaries, but transmediaries. These are players in the ecosystem whose entrepreneurial mission is to foster the collaboration. So you have a company, you have a government, everybody has a particular type of mission. And often trying to is the challenge. These transmediaries have one entrepreneurial mission. It is to foster the collaboration. And it's the presence of these transmediaries that make these ecosystems gel. And this is now an active area of research, particularly by myself and others, trying to figure out how do we create more of these transmediaries. The problem is how do you incentivize them? Let me give you a very quick example. In payments, where it's often very difficult, as has already been raised by Yi, you have a challenge with SMEs getting paid across borders. Let's say you have a small e-commerce platform in Kenya and you want to sell to the US. For many years, the problem was payments. There are a lot of payment platforms that have developed. The challenge has always been trying to address the arbitrage issues that arise between multiple regulatory systems. Now we find that unless you have a transmediary whose sole goal is to create solutions at that level and others are willing to incentivize them or to reward them for doing so, it never happens. So I think that is the one thing that we've discovered that will make these ecosystems possible, which then will make possible the adoption of these technologies by SMEs and their integration into global value chains.
Thank you. I just want to discuss the human factor in this a little, because Cecilia, Ugaz, Estrada, when you talked earlier about the importance of collaboration across multiple stakeholders, skills training and education is one of the vital issues for that, because it requires input from all across the spectrum to be really effective. How do we develop, how do we nurture the skilled labor in developing nations so that we can develop local production to supply chains that span the globe?
You know, I think there is, it's the whole issue of technical training, technical and vocational training on one side. So we are not really talking about, in this case, I think, university kind of training. I think it's a more technical training that is required, and in particular training on the job. Trying to build the skills really that are immediately applied to the current hand. But I think what is very interesting is, there are some countries that are already using some kind of model of twinning, sort of trying to bring the experience from, other countries who are far ahead in terms of development, of developing the technologies, in order to sort of have direct exposure to the technologies at the level of small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, one case that comes to mind, is in my region, is in Uruguay, where we have a center, a mechatronics center, that has been, put together by the Ministry of Industry of Uruguay and a company that is called Festo. And they basically try to do these kind of things, sort of doing some trainings, in situ, trying to bring the technology and expose workers to the way, different things work. I think there are lots of examples. I mean, this is the one that comes to mind at the moment. I think this is one side of it. And then the other side of it is, the whole issue of science, technology, and innovation, and how do we bring this, when we are really doing industrial policy? Because one of the things that we are really missing, I think, in developing countries is also a better next way of working at the level of the industrial sector. And this is everything that needs to be done there. There are also, I think there, of course, I mean, we can talk about incentive, we can talk about many other things, but I think it's very important to revitalize that kind of nexus, and of course to try to provide some funds, because otherwise the kind of absorption of technology that at the moment we are needing in developing countries will not happen automatically. And that's something I think that developing country governments should be very, it's not something that will happen just because for industrial revolution is here, but I really think that we need deliberately efforts, and these efforts sometimes, pass by having, clever, funds put together at the reach of research centers that will be able to sort of, modify the technologies, adapt the technologies, play with them, and then, put it, at the disposal of the industrial sector to be applied.
Thank you. Xiaozhun. Population at large are huge factors in industrial development, particularly as we move towards an advanced manufacturing, high-tech, high-knowledge economy.
Well, I agree with Cecilia that I think capacity building is a big challenge, and it's extremely important for developing countries. But as far as I know, currently, multi-agency program for trade and the enhanced integrated framework provide developing countries and the least developed countries framework with financial and technical support, so they can catch up on the adoption of digital technologies. And the digital skills development should also become an important element of education, and training programs such as those run by World Bank, international labor organizations, or regional development banks. I think that kind of multilateral efforts should be strengthened. But besides that, I want to point another one, which is also extremely important for developing countries to participate in GVCs. that is the ICT infrastructure. Without ICT infrastructure, it's really difficult or almost impossible for them to enter into digital economy. So in many countries, I think this issue can be addressed by attracting foreign direct investment and by regulatory reforms that minimize unnecessary burdens to trade in services. So in my view, I mean, in WTO, our WTO members are negotiating a multilateral framework on that issue. If they can succeed, I think developing countries can benefit a lot.
Thank you very much. We're in the last few minutes of our discussion now, so I want to get some concluding thoughts from each of you. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about the role of larger corporations in nurturing skills, in encouraging technological development, and encouraging the uptake of new technology by the many smaller businesses throughout their supply chain throughout the world. Bright Simon, Bright Simmons, let's have your thoughts on this first.
Absolutely. So the first point to note regarding technical and vocational training and its its nexus with capacity development is that if people don't have the experience of doing things, they can't teach things. So the problem that we've had in a lot of the developing countries is that you have a lot of these technical teachers or vocational teachers who have no industrial experience. Obviously, they're not going to be able to train anybody to acquire industrial experience. And if we take the experience of Asia in particular, we know that a lot of the skills were acquired in the supply chain itself. So a lot of it was big corporations in the US and Europe that went into Taiwan, elsewhere, and then because they needed to acquire these intermediate inputs at low cost, they invested a lot of money bringing up local suppliers up to scratch. And even today, a lot of the technology transfer that happens goes along with skills. So if I want to start producing a new chip in Vietnam, not only do I have to make sure that the financing exists and the FDI is in place to get a plant up and going, I need to send technology to Vietnam. And then I need to make sure that the Vietnamese colleagues are well skilled. So I think the biggest way to transfer skills is the supply chain itself. Is the supply chain and its dynamics, which enables the skills flow to happen in a manner that is both effective as well as resourceful. Thank you.
But Brett Simmons, just to continue that thought, is there an obligation, a moral obligation, a commercial obligation, however you choose to perceive it? Is there an obligation on larger companies to nurture this throughout their supply chain?
I think there's a strategic self-interest dimension to this. When I set out myself to build solutions that at that time did not exist anywhere in the world, I could not convince the pharmaceutical industry, which was my initial target, to adopt the technology. I had to go hand in hand with Hewlett-Packard, who already had their trust. And it's in working with Hewlett-Packard that I came to understand how you get a company like Sanofi or a company like GSK or whatever using technologies developed by a third party. So I believe that the reason why HP was so keen on working with us was because we're defining a frontier that their own internal operations could simply not be amended to achieve. So essentially, they had a certain risk-averse mindset in certain domains, which as a startup, we didn't have. Because as a startup, we didn't have, they felt that we could be the vanguard to some of that R&D activity. So I think it's in the strategic self-interest of big multinationals to see SMEs and startups as their strategic vanguard into new domains, and particularly into cutting-edge R&D.
Thank you. Xiaozhun.
Well, I think your question shows how important the GVCs for developing countries, for those smaller economies and smaller firms to develop. Without GVCs, it's almost impossible for them to catch up. But if you look at the experience in Asian countries, all those Asian developing economies with fast development, technology spillover effect, So if other developing countries want to have a quick and faster development, I guess they have to copy some of those policies to welcome the foreign investment, to facilitate trade and investment, so they will have a better opportunity to join the GVC and to get technology.
Cecilia, Ugaz, Estrada, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I definitely agree with the thoughts, presented already by the fellow panelists. I think it's, of course, it's a moral imperative, I would say, for, big transnational corporations to really induce this kind of, and provide a proper, learning process within the, the participation in the value chain. That's, a sine qua non condition. I think also, well, at UNIDO, we are really in the business also to try to help countries, the governments in particular, to be able to provide also some kind of this learning infrastructure. I mean, the Kindness Center, for instance, that we mentioned before in Uruguay, was also something that was actually supported really by UNIDO, in the work that we were doing in the country. I think, by all means, the only way that we can really get developing countries jumping into the, sort of progressing into the global value chains is by this process of learning happening within the value chain itself. And also, government supporting the whole process, providing also adequate incentives for, the companies that are engaged on this to be able to pick it up.
Thank you. That ends our discussion. I know that you will want to join me in thanking your three superb speakers, Bright Simmons, Xiaozhun Yi, and Cecilia Ugaz Estrada. I want to thank you for watching this GMIS digital series.